Man of Steel is one of the greatest comic book movies ever made and easily the most underrated. Hey guys, I'm John Campea, and I've basically been saying that for about 7 years, to the point that my regular viewers are probably getting sick of hearing me say it. But you know, I thought after all these years, I should probably do a little bit of a deeper dive into why Man of Steel, a movie that a lot of people don't even like, to be honest with you, has such a special place and why I consider it to be so tremendously underrated. Now, I should point out before we get started here, the purpose of this video is not to convince you to like the movie if you don't like it. All film is subjective. If you don't like Man of Steel, no problem with that. But really more of a deep dive, like I said, to kind of explain and get into why I find the movie to be so compelling, so good, and truly one of the best of the genre. So without any further ado, here is my case for Man of Steel as the most underrated superhero film of all time. When talking about Man of Steel and how underrated it is, one has to remember the context in which it came out. By July of 2013, when Man of Steel debuted, there was no such thing as the DCEU yet, and it had been just 1 year since the conclusion of Christopher Nolan's Dark Knight trilogy. Marvel's MCU had already released 7 feature films: Iron Man in May of 2008, The Incredible Hulk in June of 2008, Iron Man 2 in April of 2010, Thor in April of 2011, Captain America: The First Avenger in July of 2011, The Avengers in April of 2012, and Iron Man 3 in April of 2013. Comic book films were on the cusp of becoming the most dominant genre at the box office, with the last 2 MCU movies, The Avengers making $1.5 billion at the box office, and Iron Man 3 making over $1.2 billion at the box office. As if the expectations for a Superman movie, the granddaddy of all superheroes, wasn't already high enough, the added inflated expectation of the MCU's success and living in the shadow of the Dark Knight trilogy took the expectations to a whole new level. But Man of Steel also faced a unique and daunting challenge that, quite frankly, the MCU films never did: a long history of beloved previous movies and TV incarnations, each of which gave audiences some understandably preconceived notions of what this Superman should be like, what this Superman should act like, and what this Superman should talk like. It was this environment that Man of Steel debuted in 2013. The environment didn't make the movie any better or any worse, but I think it's important to keep those circumstances in mind when thinking back to what the audience's initial reaction to it were. So with that out of the way, let's talk about Man of Steel itself. You see, to me, Zack Snyder's film audaciously attempts, and in my opinion achieves, some of the most bold, honest, and grounded storytelling we have ever seen in the comic book genre. It addresses both huge global issues and small, intimate, character-driven ones that culminates in a character-driven film with tremendous action and a universe-spanning mythos that delivers the best pure superhero origin story ever put to film. Right from the beginning of the movie, David Goyer's script immediately dives us into important thematic elements that play a very important part throughout the entire rest of the story. We as an audience are initially introduced to Krypton, an advanced alien civilization that also serves as a cautionary tale for our own world. Krypton is on the brink of an ecological disaster that will destroy their planet, a race of beings whose ambition and hubris lead them to mismanage their own world's resources and was hurling them towards their ultimate doom. But this isn't some kind of heavy-handed ecological metaphor for Earth's own environmental issues. Snyder and Goyer are actually laying the foundation narratively here that culminates near the end of the film when Superman ultimately decides to save humanity over restoring Kryptonian civilization because, as Kal-El put it to Zod, Krypton had its chance. It's also here on Krypton that we see the birth of Kal-El, who emerges as something of a messianic figure right from birth. The first naturally born child in their culture in centuries. Sort of the reverse of an immaculate conception, you could say. It's that messianic symbolism that resonates through the rest of the film, both as a symbol of inspiration, hope, and destiny, but also one of heaviness, loneliness, and burden that comes along with being a messianic figure that weighs on Clark and his struggle for identity later in the film. Messianic symbolism isn't anything new to Superman storytelling, but burden and identity struggle are in this medium. But we'll cover that more later. It's also here on Krypton that Snyder gives an excellent narrative upgrade to the traditional Zod-Jor-El enmity story that others have engaged in many times. In other renditions of the relationship, Zod hates Jor-El because, to put it admittedly over simply, Jor-El foiled Zod's evil plans of conquest. But in Man of Steel, so much more depth and motivation is given. Here, Jor-El and Zod are essentially on the same side of the disaster issue. Both know Krypton is coming to ruin, and both hold the Kryptonian Council responsible for the calamity about to befall them all. Both are also resolutely committed to trying to save Krypton's future, but by radically different means. So when Jor-El embeds the Kryptonian Codex, the genetic code for billions of future Kryptonians, into his son Kal-El and sends them both off into space, Zod sees it as a betrayal of Krypton itself, dooming their civilization to extinction. In Zod's eyes, Jor-El is the villain. This gives fantastic narrative depth to the rage Zod feels against Jor-El later on in the film. There is no bitterness that can equal one that comes from betrayal. Zod's flawed perception of events is that Jor-El betrayed him and Krypton instead of the other way around. The other brilliant thing this turn of events does is that it fleshes out in a much better way than previous iterations of Superman stories why Zod is so hell-bent on capturing and later killing Kal-El. You see, in previous movies, Zod just hated Superman because, well, he hated his daddy, which is fine, but taking that animosity, which was already deepened because of the betrayal perception of Zod, and adding it to the element of the Codex being in Kal-El adds to the depth and motivation for Zod later on. He doesn't just want Kal-El to settle some juvenile score with Clark's long-dead birth daddy, but getting Clark means, to Zod, the salvation of Krypton itself. This notion of saving Krypton as opposed to just wanting to rule Krypton gives more depth and dimension to the character of Zod, who instead of just being a mustache-twirling villain, is also a man who sees himself as having a noble purpose, the salvation of his people and civilization. The merging of the Codex into Kal-El also gives greater weight to the sacrifice that Jor-El and Lara make, ensuring the escape of not just their son, because let's face it, any parent would do that, but also of their entire culture's future. They're not just parents wanting to save their own kid, but also true Kryptonian patriots who also try to save the future of their people from extinction, and the warped totalitarianism that Zod would bring about were he to acquire the Codex. Goodbye, my son. Our hopes and dreams travel with you. As Kal-El's parents prepare to launch their son into the stars towards Earth, a fight breaks out between Zod and Jor-El, both fighting for what they believe to be the hope for the future of their people. By making the scene a physical manifestation of warring ideologies, Snyder turns what could have been a random generic fight between a hero and a villain into a dramatic conflict with very real narrative purpose, something that Snyder and Goyer continue to do throughout the rest of the film. Zod is ultimately captured and condemned, but what we as the audience realize during his judgment and what further drives his conviction that he was right. The Kryptonian Council and their actions condemned all of Krypton to destruction and ruin. His solution was flawed, but he was right. This whole angle to Zod gives him an almost Thanos-like dimension. Whereas Thanos saw himself as the hero of the story, Zod ultimately saw himself as the hero of the story, trying desperately to save his civilization and people. This conviction based on their perceived truth is what gives characters like Thanos and Zod another level of depth than the average movie villain. This conviction is given full credence near the end of the film when Zod is left devastated after he fails to save his people following Kal-El's destruction of the Genesis Chamber. Alright, with the planet Krypton now destroyed, we flash forward to Earth with a fully grown Clark working on a fishing boat pursuing his spirit quest to find himself and the secrets of who he really is. And our very first exposure to Clark is one that shows us his attitude towards humanity. Unlike a character like, say, Magneto, who early on in his life sees the absolute worst in humanity, Clark has seen the best in humanity. In the scene on the fishing boat, the first action we see is another fisherman risking his own life to save Clark, who would have been totally fine, but he didn't know that. Then their boat, full of just regular fishermen, races off to try to offer aid to a burning oil platform. He is around mortals being heroic. It's this heroism that I believe inspires Superman to sacrifice his secret anonymous life on the fishing boat to leave the boat to save the other men on the oil rig. He goes directly from watching a frail human trying to save his life to being willing to walk away from his cover to save others. This is when we hit our first flashback of Clark as a child. This is where Man of Steel does something else kind of unusual for a comic book film. You see, most superhero origin stories portray the heroes discovering their gifts as some kind of fantastic and wonderful experience. Things like Peter Parker celebrating the freedom and power of being able to climb up buildings and swing across the city, or Shazam experimenting with his incredible new powers. Man of Steel decides to show us the confusion, fear, and panic that a kid like Clark would have felt if completely unexplainable things were suddenly happening to him. You see, it's this scene that lays out for us the approach that the filmmakers decided to take with Clark. A man in our world who realizes he is not of our world and on a journey to discover his place in it. It's not clean and polished and shiny like our traditional understanding of Superman and his origins, but it speaks to something more honest, more true, and yeah, even more real. This leads into the pivotal flashback of Clark saving the school bus. It reveals to the audience his inherent goodness, yes, but also the moral foundation given to him by his adopted father, Jonathan Kent, played brilliantly by Kevin Costner. The scene isn't meant so much to give us a deeper understanding of Clark per se, but rather to give us as the audience more of an understanding of Jonathan Kent. His parental love for Clark exceeds his care for anything else. The safety and protection of Clark is Jonathan's absolute first priority. He has a sense that Clark has a destiny that will alter the fate of the world, but he also firmly believes that Clark has to discover it for himself and in his own time when he's ready. And until that time, Pa Kent will do anything to protect him. Ultimately, Jonathan Kent gives his life later in the film to protect Clark's secret because, in his mind, his fate and that of the world rely on it. That belief that Jonathan Kent had about Clark is summed up perfectly in the discussion that he and Clark have after the school bus incident, in which Clark says, "What was I supposed to do? Just let them die? Maybe. There's more at stake here than just our lives, Clark, or the lives of those around us. When the world finds out what you can do, it's going to change everything. Our beliefs, our notions of what it means to be human, everything." Again, this belief was so central to who and what Jonathan Kent was and his unshakable love for Clark that he later dives for the belief, which again we'll discuss a little bit later. Upon Jonathan revealing to Clark his alien origins, the most emotionally true moment I have ever seen in any comic book film in my life takes place as a confused and distraught Clark looks up at Jonathan and pleads with him, "Can't I just keep pretending I'm your son?" To which Jonathan, filled with reserved emotion, takes him in his arms and proclaims to him, "You are my son." I Love You 3000 is nice and everything, but when Jonathan Kent embraces Clark and says, "You are my son," I nearly break down every frickin' time I see it. This also points to an absolute must-understand thing about Clark Kent. Clark could only be who he was because he was loved. He was loved unconditionally. He was loved completely, and he had the freedom to explore the struggles, uncertainty, and questions of his own existence because he knew he was so unconditionally loved by two seemingly unremarkable human parents. Parents who helped shape the decisions and direction the life of the Superman would ultimately become. The search that Jonathan tells Clark he'll need to embark on later in his life is what leads him to discovering the Kryptonian ship and meeting Jor-El. Jor-El has similar well-meaning intentions for his son as Jonathan does, but they are also unique from Jonathan's hopes. Whereas Jonathan seems to nudge Clark towards choosing to be a good man and one that will help humanity, Jor-El sees Kal-El as much the same way, except also as a messianic figure, a guide, and possibly even maybe the ruler of humanity for them. This adds another layer to the internal struggle Clark must face, as his search for identity has to pass through the filters of two well-meaning, loving, and yet ideologically different fathers. It's these kinds of dynamics that sets Man of Steel apart from most run-of-the-mill comic book movie fare, and it's handled with beautiful directness and subtlety at the same time. This encounter with Jor-El leads us to what I think is the actual birth of Superman. Clark emerges through the ship doors, now in his recognizable Superman costume, and takes his first flight. I won't dwell much on this first flight scene, except to say I get chills every single time I see it. The visual style they choose of him flying was perfect. Combined with Zimmer's score, Superman's first flight is simply one of the most thrilling moments in a comic book movie ever for me. Okay, we've built up to it, but this now brings us to what I believe is the most misunderstood moment of Man of Steel, and probably the most important moment: the death of Jonathan Kent. There are some people who criticize Jonathan Kent's death because they saw it as unnecessary, that Clark could have easily saved Jonathan, and indeed would have saved Jonathan in that moment. But to me, that interpretation represents a lack of understanding of everything we've learned about Jonathan Kent and what he imparted to Clark and believed in the movie all the way up to this point. Remember what Jonathan tells Clark earlier in the film: "You have to decide what kind of man you want to grow up to be, Clark, because whoever that man is, good character or bad, he's going to change the world." You also have to keep in mind that Jonathan's commitment to Clark and the need for Clark to keep his secret until he was properly ready for his own sake and for the sake of the world was so complete that he was willing to die to protect it. And Clark knew that. Clark clearly wanted to go and save his father. You could see it written all over his face, and probably would have saved anybody else in that situation. But Jonathan had spent Clark's entire life driving that message into him, that his identity had to be protected, because nothing short of the future of the world depended on it. It was that important to Jonathan, and Clark knew it. Jonathan Kent being willing to die was the ultimate expression of his love for Clark, and Clark being willing to let Jonathan die for that belief was the ultimate expression of his love and respect for him. And so, what some people call a silly scene, to me, is one of the most emotionally resonant and profound character moments in any film in the genre. With the death of Jonathan Kent, now is a good time to point out one of the other major strengths of the film, which is the cast. In particularly here in this situation, Diane Lane as Martha. Why did you say that name? Kent. With Pa Kent gone, Clark needed another emotional anchor to his humanity, and by extension to our world, and that comes through brilliantly with his mother-son relationship and the chemistry between Lane and Henry Cavill. I bought into their attachment so much that when Zod and the other Kryptonians show up at the Kent farm and begin to harass Martha, all I could think was, holy shit, you have f***ed up. Clark is going to f*** you all up. So when Clark does arrive and grabs Zod and screams at him, "You think you can threaten my mother?" I nearly jumped out of my seat in the theater and yelled, "Yeah, Superman, this fool up." And I just don't know if I have that reaction if we didn't buy into Clark's attachment and relationship with his parents. The consistency of that connection to his parents is also a brilliant aspect to the movie that keeps paying off as the story moves forward. For example, when we come to the scene in the church as Clark is wrestling if he should turn himself over to Zod, the priest asks him, "What does your gut tell you?" Instead of just giving a standard Superman kind of response, we hear echoes of Jonathan Kent and his reservations. Superman says that Zod can't be trusted. The problem is, I'm not sure the people of Earth can be either. Pa Kent is always there with him. His fears, his teachings, and his reservations, and that was really obvious in this scene, and it's just beautiful. You see, that sort of narrative consistency is present with all the characters in the movie, including General Zod and his core motivations. In his first conversation with Clark, Zod explains that he traveled to all the old Kryptonian outposts, finding nothing but death since they were all cut off from Krypton long ago. He tried everything and went to extraordinary lengths to try to save his people. This is important because it re-emphasizes that in Zod's mind, there really is nothing left of Krypton and therefore has to be regenerated from the Codex on Earth, even if that means resulting in the extinction of humanity. Okay, now here's where things get spicy. I want to talk about the most spectacular thing in Man of Steel, but also the source of most of its controversy: the incredible action. The combat action sequences in the third act of Man of Steel is some of the most awe-inspiring fight scenes in all of comic book movies. The fights are visceral, exhaustively paced, and completely unbound. Zack Snyder does a remarkable job of switching between taking us up close and intimate in the fights, and then changing gears to observe the battles from far away, making us in the audience feel like real spectators, as if we were actually watching this war of the gods from the ground miles away. This perspective shifting engages us in the action and always feeling the heavy drama of it. And that's the key. The action is drama. Every comic book film and action film, for that matter, has lots of action, but action without narrative purpose is just visual noise. Every punch, every crash, and every throw in the fights are soaked in the drama and narrative that the movie already laid the foundation of. As Clark and Zod battle, we see the visual echoes of Clark's connection to humanity, his parents, and the end of his struggle for identity. We also see Zod with his perceived betrayal of Krypton and his desire and obsession of saving his people. When action in a movie is saturated in the drama of the story, it elevates it from just a fight scene to that of iconic dramatic conflict. It reminds me a lot of the battle on Titan in Infinity War. Every movement of action is anchored by narrative and drama that was foundational before the battle ever even started. Only, you know, Man of Steel got there first. There are those, however, that disconnect from Man of Steel because of a belief that too much destruction was caused by the battles, that Superman didn't do enough to prevent collateral damage. Some even say that Superman never thought or worried about saving people during his fights. And while I completely respect anybody who watched Man of Steel and simply didn't like it, this particular argument is, well, just ridiculous. For example, let's go to the fight between Superman and Faora in Smallville. During that scene, while Clark is trying to fight off two super-powered and military-trained Kryptonians, he diverts his attention to save individuals in no less than 3 different occasions. He saves the Air Force pilot when Faora was about to destroy his plane, he saves the soldier from falling out of the helicopter, and he saves the colonel when Faora was about to knife him to death. The point is, Superman was always disengaging from his fights when it was possible, and it often wasn't, to turn his attention to saving people, so I reject that argument outright. Now, with regards to the criticism that Superman could have fought these Kryptonians without there being any collateral damage, well, I don't think the narrative of the story lends any credibility to that theory whatsoever. In debating the destruction of the battles between Superman and Kryptonians, you have to first understand what was at stake. The Kryptonians were not there to rob a bank. They weren't there to rule. They weren't there to steal some artifact. Zod and Faora and the rest of the Kryptonians repeatedly made it clear to Clark that their mission was the death of every single human being on Earth, to wipe out humanity. The grim words of Faora, "You will not win. For every human you save, we will kill 1,000,000 more." Combined with Zod's plan of terraforming humanity right out of existence, Clark was fighting these godlike beings for nothing short of the lives of every single man, woman, and child on the face of the earth. He was fighting to save billions of lives against vastly superior forces who outnumbered him and have been combat and military trained since their birth. Clark had been Superman for a day, and this is a significant point that I think a lot of people forget. Clark had been Superman, only really beginning to discover the potential of his abilities, not to mention flight, for a little over a day. A unit of highly skilled and trained Kryptonian soldiers against a farm boy from Kansas. Basically, the fight was going to happen wherever the Kryptonians wanted the fight to happen, and there really wasn't much Clark could do about it except fight them nonetheless and try to save people where and when he could. By the way, a quick but important side note that I think needs to be thrown in here is another unique thing Snyder and Goyer do that not a lot of other comic book movies try. You see, in a lot of comic book films, humanity sits by and waits for the heroes to save them. But in Man of Steel, humanity plays an important part in their own salvation. While Clark is off in the Southern Hemisphere trying to take out the World Engine, it's up to humanity to take out Zod's main ship. The military strike on Zod's forces near the end of the film, the Doctor figuring out how to get the House of El key to engage Kal-El's shuttle to ignite the Phantom Drive, the Colonel heroically sacrificing himself by flying his plane into Zod's ship, causing the Kryptonians on board to become trapped in the Singularity, the pilots and soldiers engaging these gods from another world, all played an important part in Superman and the rest of humanity winning the day. And in the end, I've always really appreciated that about the story. Okay, now we come to the final fight between Superman and Zod. Keep Zod's mindset in mind here. After destroying the World Engine, Superman engages Zod, and when he was about to destroy the scout ship Zod was piloting and carrying the Genesis Chamber, Zod pleads with Superman not to destroy it since it would end the Kryptonian civilization forever. In that moment, Zod not only sees himself as a great hero, but Kal-El as the villain about to do something monstrous in his eyes, the final destruction of Krypton. After the dust settles and Zod's Genesis chamber is eliminated, any hopes that Zod had of bringing back his race was destroyed. Zod is now a broken man and communicates to Clark that he has now nothing left to live for except to kill every human being on Earth to cause Kal-El pain. His mission was one of salvation for his people, but now it's purely for the death of humanity out of pure vengeance. Zod once again reiterates to Clark, "There is only one way this ends, Kal. Either you die or I do." Zod makes it perfectly clear that he has no reason to live now other than the destruction of Earth and that he will never stop. When their fight leads them to Clark having a rear choke on Zod, the script puts Superman into a position where he was forced to make a choice. With no viable options available to him to either restrain or subdue Zod, Superman has to decide to either kill Zod in that moment or allow Zod to continue to destroy everything around him and kill all the people that he can. This isn't a situation people want to see Superman in, and it isn't a situation that he asked for. But here he was, and a choice had to be made. His choice, his only choice, was to do the unthinkable and kill General Zod before he killed billions of people. The weight of that moment was made clear as Clark let out a painful cry after killing Zod. Not only did he kill somebody, he was now truly alone in the universe because, well, he killed the last of his species. It was a horrible moment, but a brave one for the filmmakers to put Superman in. As a matter of fact, the entire movie of Man of Steel avoided putting Clark in easy, clean, and tidy situations, and it ends the film on that same note. And that note was heavy and powerful at the same time. Any other interpretation of the events in those final moments are disregarding everything we know about the circumstances that the story led us to, and Superman to. And it was handled beautifully. And so, with brilliant mythology, outstanding dedication to character development, thrilling action, difficult moral dilemmas, a multidimensional villain, and a hero whose quest was not just to save the day, but also find himself and his place in the world, Man of Steel to me is one of the greatest films of the genre of all time, and easily the most underrated. Granted, it may not have been the most happy-go-lucky apple pie Superman many were looking for, but it's the one we needed and the one that worked better for our time. So thank you, David Goyer. Thank you, Zack Snyder, for the best iteration of the best superhero of all time. So there you have it, folks. Those are my reasons that I believe Man of Steel is one of the greatest comic book movies of all time and certainly the most underrated. And again, the purpose of this video is not to convince you to change your mind about anything, but hopefully during the course of this video, I've at least given you a few different perspectives to look at. Anyway, guys, that'll do it for this editorial. Thanks a lot for being here. My name is John Campea, and until my next video, bye-bye.